After my mom died, my dad remarried a gold digger who immediately started pushing me out. When she demanded I give up my bedroom to her daughter, while I was literally paying my dad's bills and business loans, I snapped, cut off all financial support, let the bank repossess the car I bought him, and walked away. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked ominously, each second stretching longer than the last, as if time itself was holding its breath. I stood frozen in the doorway of my bedroom, my sanctuary since childhood, watching in numb disbelief as my stepsister Lila ran her manicured fingers along the spines of my books, pausing occasionally to examine one with feigned interest. The afternoon sun streamed through the bay window, casting long shadows that seemed to creep toward me like accusatory fingers. Evelyn, my stepmother, stood beside Lila with that carefully cultivated smile of hers, the one that looked pleasant enough to outsiders but carried the sharpness of a knife hidden beneath silk. "We've decided it would be best if Lila moved in here," she announced, as casually as if she were suggesting a change in dinner plans. "The guest room simply isn't suitable for her anymore." My lungs constricted. The guest room. That's what they were calling my space now. A temporary holding cell for a daughter who no longer belonged. I forced air in my chest, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. "This isn't a guest room," I said, my voice low but trembling with the effort to keep it steady. "This is my room. My home." The floorboards creaked behind me as my father entered, his footsteps heavy with the weight of a decision already made. His face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. "Sweetheart," he began, using that infuriatingly placating tone, the one reserved for tantruming children and unreasonable demands. "Lila needs the space more. You're hardly ever home these days anyway. The smaller room will be fine." A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. "Are you serious?" The words came out sharper than I intended, laced with a bitterness that had been festering for months. "After everything I've done," Evelyn's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "What exactly have you done?" she interrupted, her voice dripping with saccharine condescension. The question hung in the air like a guillotine. I turned to my father, waiting, praying for him to speak up, to remind her of the brand new sedan I'd gifted him last Christmas when his old clunker finally died. To throw in her face the months I'd covered the mortgage when his business struggled, the utility bills I'd paid without complaint, the loan installments I'd quietly taken over so he wouldn't lose the company Mom had helped him build. But he just stared at his shoes, the way he always did when Evelyn held court. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't going to defend me. Not anymore. My vision blurred at the edges, but I refused to let the tears fall. Instead, I laughed a raw, jagged sound that made Lila flinch. "You know what? Fine." I took a step forward, my voice dropping to something dangerous. "But when the banks start calling about the loan defaults, when the lights get cut off, when that shiny new car gets repossessed, don't you dare come crying to me." Evelyn's mask slipped for just a second, her lips thinning into a bloodless line. "That's quite enough," she snapped, her polished facade cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "You don't get to make threats in this house." "This house," I echoed, my pulse roaring in my ears. "I've paid for half of this house. The down payment, the taxes, the—" "Enough." My father's voice cracked like a whip, his face mottled with uncharacteristic anger. "If you're going to be ungrateful, maybe you should leave." Silence. The words landed like a death sentence. I stared at him, really stared, searching for any trace of the man who used to carry me on his shoulders, who held me together after Mom died, who promised through his own tears that we'd always be a team. But the father I knew was gone. In his place stood a hollow stranger, his eyes as familiar as the house I grew up in, but his soul entirely unrecognizable. Something inside me shattered. Without a word, I turned to my dresser and yanked open the top drawer, the wood screeching in protest. I grabbed armfuls of clothes, not bothering to fold them, and shoved them into the duffel bag I used for gym trips. My hands moved mechanically, my mind blessedly blank, because if I let myself think, if I let myself feel— "Where do you think you're going to go?" Evelyn's voice was laced with faux concern, but her eyes glittered with victory. "You can't just run away like a child." I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for the framed photo on my nightstand. Mom and me at the beach, her sun hat tipped rakishly to one side, both of us laughing at some long-forgotten joke. The glass was cool against my fingertips, the only real thing in this nightmare. My father made a strangled noise. "You're overreacting," he tried, but the words rang hollow. "This isn't." I slung the bag over my shoulder and finally met his gaze. "You made your choice. I said quietly. Now live with it. For a fleeting second, something like panic flickered across his face. You'll regret this, he called after me as I strode down the hallway, my footsteps echoing like gunshots. I paused at the front door, my hand on the knob. The house smelled like lemon polish and Evelyn's expensive perfume, nothing like the vanilla and lavender that used to linger when Mom was alive. No, I said softly, more to myself than to him. I won't. Then I stepped into the twilight, letting the door slam shut behind me with finality. The first raindrops began to fall as I reached my car, as if the sky itself was mourning what I'd just lost, or maybe celebrating what I'd finally gained. My freedom. The motel room's digital clock glowed 5:37 a.m. when I finally stirred from my stiff, uncomfortable position on the lumpy mattress. Dawn's first light seeped through the thin curtains, painting stripes of pale gold across the stained carpet. My body ached from the restless night, every muscle tense with the residual anger that had kept me awake for hours. I reached for the framed photo on the nightstand, the glass cool against my fingertips. Mom's smiling face stared back at me, frozen in time at that beach trip 3 summers ago. The memory hit me with physical force, the salty breeze tangling our hair, her sun hat tipped precariously as she laughed at some joke I'd made, the way she'd squeeze my shoulder and call me her rock when Dad was going through one of his business slumps. The contrast between that memory and last night's confrontation made my stomach churn. I set the photo down carefully, as if it might shatter from the weight of my thoughts. The motion disturbed a thin layer of dust on the nightstand, particles swirling in the morning light like the fragments of my broken family. A sharp knock at the door startled me. Housekeeping, a voice called, though the sun had barely risen. I mumbled a refusal through the door and listened as the cart squeaked away down the walkway. The interruption pulled me fully into the present, and with it came the crushing reality of my situation. I was homeless. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, a strange calm settled over me as I methodically unpacked my duffel bag, hanging the few clothes I'd grabbed in the tiny closet. Each garment carried memories. The sweater Mom had knitted for my last birthday, the blouse I'd worn to her funeral, the jeans with the coffee stain from when Dad and I used to have her Saturday breakfast at the diner. The diner. Another casualty of Evelyn's takeover. Our ritual had lasted exactly 3 months after the wedding before Evelyn started scheduling family brunches at home, where Lila dominated the conversation and Evelyn made passive-aggressive comments about my career choices. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the springs creaking in protest, and reached for my phone. 27 missed calls. 15 texts. I didn't need to look to know who they were from. The last message preview showed Dad's name, followed by, "We need to talk about this like adults." My thumb hovered over the delete button. Instead, I powered off the device entirely and tossed it onto the nightstand, where it landed with a hollow thunk next to Mom's photo. The silence was deafening. In that quiet, the memories came flooding back, not as disjointed fragments, but as a devastating timeline of how I'd become the family ATM. I remember the first request, just 2 weeks after Evelyn moved in. Dad had come to me with bloodshot eyes, explaining how the business was struggling, how he needed to make payroll. Just until the Johnson account pays up, he'd promised. I'd handed over $5,000 from my savings without hesitation. Then came the car. His ancient sedan finally gave out, and Evelyn had been complaining about having to drive him everywhere. Just until I get back on my feet, he'd said when I surprised him with a new model for his birthday. The way his face had lit up almost made the dent in my savings worth it. Almost. The requests became more frequent. The mortgage payment when Dad forgot to transfer funds. The utilities when the automatic payment didn't go through. Lila's college textbooks. Evelyn's emergency dental work. Each time, the promises to repay grew vaguer, the guilt trips more pronounced. The final straw had come last month when I'd overheard Evelyn bragging to her sister on the phone about how she'd trained him well when it came to managing my finances. The casual cruelty in her voice had made me physically ill. Now, sitting in the shabby motel room, I opened my laptop and pulled up my banking app. The numbers stared back at me, not just my current balances, but the meticulous records I'd kept of every cent I'd given them over the past year. $87,532.47. Enough for a down payment on a nice condo. Enough to take 6 months off work and travel the world. Enough to start the business I'd always dreamed of. Instead, it had vanished into the black hole of Dad's failing business and Evelyn's expensive tastes. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up payment histories, automatic transfers, authorized users. One by one, I severed the financial ties that had bound me to them. The business loan payments canceled. The utility auto pays terminated. The car insurance discontinued. The credit card I'd foolishly added Dad to reported stolen. With each click, a weight lifted from my shoulders. With each confirmation email that hit my inbox, I could breathe a little easier. The final step was the hardest. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to the local courthouse website. The forms for small claims court loaded slowly, the pixels arranging themselves into neat boxes waiting to be filled with my grievances. I closed the laptop before I could start typing. Not yet. First, I needed to see how they'd react when the money stopped flowing. Needed to know if Dad would finally wake up and see what was happening. Needed to give him one last chance to choose me over her. Outside, the morning traffic had picked up, the sounds of car horns and rumbling engines filtering through the thin walls. The world was moving on, with or without me. I picked up Mom's photo again, running my thumb along the smooth wooden frame. "What would you do?" I whispered to her frozen smile. But I already knew the answer. Mom had always been too forgiving, too willing to see the good in people. It's what made her special, and it's what killed her in the end, trusting the wrong doctor, giving one too many second chances. I wouldn't make the same mistake. The phone sat silent on the nightstand, its dark screen reflecting my tired face back at me. Somewhere across town, my father was probably panicking as the first notifications hit his phone. The electricity bill unpaid. The business account overdrawn. The car insurance canceled. Let him panic. Let him struggle. Let him finally understand what it felt like to be used. I set the photo back in its place of honor and stood, stretching the kinks from my back. The day was young, and I had an apartment to find, a new life to build. One without leeches, one without betrayals, one where I answered to no one but myself. The first call came at exactly 9:17 a.m. I was sitting in a coffee shop across from my new apartment, savoring the bitter tang of espresso and the unfamiliar thrill of freedom when my phone lit up with Dad's name. I let it ring, watching as the screen flashed, then went dark. 3 minutes later, it rang again, and again, and again. By the fifth call, I silenced my phone and turned it face down on the table. The barista shot me a sympathetic look as she wiped down the counter. "Trouble in paradise?" she asked with a knowing smirk. I smiled for the first time in days. Something like that. The voicemails piled up. First, confusion. Then frustration. Then outright panic. "Sweetheart, I don't know what's going on, but the bank just called about the loan payment. The electricity got shut off. Evelyn is furious. Call me back. This isn't funny anymore. The dealership says the insurance lapsed." The final message came at 3:48 p.m. His voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "Please, just tell me what you want." I deleted them all. Day 3. The repo man came at dawn. I know because Evelyn sent me a string of increasingly unhinged texts, complete with grainy photos of the tow truck hauling away the sleek silver sedan I'd bought Dad last Christmas. "How could you do this to us? Your father is hysterical. Call me right now, you ungrateful bitch." I blocked her number. Day 5. The pounding on my apartment door startled me awake. I peered through the peephole to see Dad standing in the hallway, his clothes rumpled, his hair greasy and unkempt. Dark circles bruised his eyes, and his hands shook as he raised them to knock again. "Go away," I said through the door. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Just talk to me. 5 minutes." I hesitated. The man standing outside looked nothing like the father I remembered. This version was hollowed out, desperate. I slid the chain lock into place before opening the door just enough to see his face. The smell of stale alcohol hit me first, then the sour tang of sweat. His shirt was wrinkled, as if he'd been sleeping in it for days. "They're going to foreclose on the business," he whispered. "The house, too. Evelyn's talking about leaving." I said nothing. His breath hitched. I know I messed up, but you have to help me. Just one more time. Please." The words settled between us like ash. One more time. How many times had I heard that before? How many checks had I written? How many promises had I believed? I looked into his bloodshot eyes and saw the truth. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done, only for getting caught. "I can't," I said simply. His face crumpled. "You'd really let us lose everything?" A cold laugh escaped me. "Funny. You didn't care when it was my everything." I closed the door before he could respond. Day 7. The email arrived at midnight. Subject: urgent business loan default. I skimmed the formal language. Final notice, immediate payment due, legal action pending. Then I forwarded it to Dad with a single line. Ask Evelyn for the money. Her response came 15 minutes later from his account. You've made your point. Now stop this childish game before you ruin your father completely. I pictured her sitting at my old desk in what used to be my room, furiously typing on my father's laptop, while Lila whined about having to take the bus to school. The image brought a smile to my face. I hit reply. It's not a game. It's consequences. Then I blocked his email too. Day 10. The eviction notice came as no surprise. Dad called from a blocked number, his voice barely recognizable. They're kicking us out, he rasped. Evelyn's packing her things. Happy now? I watched the sunset from my apartment balcony, the city lights twinkling below. Somewhere out there, my father was finally facing the reality I'd lived with for months. No, I said truthfully, but I'm free. The line went dead. The pounding on my door at 2:37 a.m. could only mean one thing. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who stood in the dim hallway, his breath ragged with panic and cheap whiskey. The staccato rhythm of his knocking, 3 fast, 2 slow, was a pattern I recognized from childhood, back when he'd come home late from business dinners and didn't want to wake Mom. I considered not answering, but the universe had other plans. Please, his voice cracked through the door, raw and broken in a way I'd never heard before. They're gone. Against my better judgment, I turned the deadbolt. The scene. My father looked like a ghost of himself, his dress shirt wrinkled and untucked, his eyes bloodshot and swollen. A duffel bag slumped at his feet like a dead animal. Evelyn left, he said before I could speak. Took Lila and half the furniture. The bank seized the rest. The smell of bourbon rolled off him in waves. I stepped back, letting him stumble inside. He collapsed onto my couch, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I crossed my arms. You're drunk. He laughed bitterly. Not drunk enough. The confession. It poured out of him in jagged pieces between swigs from the flask he'd pulled from his coat pocket. How Evelyn had been draining his accounts for months. How Lila wasn't even his child. A DNA test confirmed it. How the business had been doomed long before I stopped the payments. But none of that matters now, he whispered, his voice breaking. I need you to know I'm sorry. The words hung between us, fragile as glass. I studied his face, the new lines around his eyes, the gray streaking his temples, and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just emptiness. Sorry for what exactly? I asked quietly. For choosing her over me? For letting her take Mom's place before the grave was cold? Or just for getting caught? His flask hit the coffee table with a clatter. All of it, he exploded, then immediately deflated. God, all of it. But especially for not seeing you. A hollow laugh escaped me. Bit late for that. The bargain. By dawn, he was bargaining. I'll go to therapy, he promised, pacing my living room. I'll sell what's left of the company. We could get a little place together, just until... No. The single word stopped in mid-step. His face crumpled. You'd really leave me with nothing? I thought of all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep in that house. All the checks I'd written. All the times I'd swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. You did that yourself, I said, walking to the door and holding it open. And unlike you, I won't let an apology buy back what you destroyed. The aftermath. He left as the sun rose, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder like a corpse. I watched from the window as he hailed a cab, his silhouette small and broken against the morning light. Part of me, the little girl who still remembered bedtime stories and piggyback rides, ached to run after him. The woman I'd become stayed perfectly still. My phone buzzed with a new email notification. The subject line made my breath catch. Your mother's estate, final disbursement. I clicked it open, the words blurring as tears I didn't know I had left finally fell. Per her instructions, the remainder of your trust becomes fully accessible on your 25th birthday. Mom had known. Somehow, she'd known I'd need an escape plan. As the first sob tore through me, I realized this was her final gift. Not just the money, but the proof that at least one parent had truly seen me. And that would have to be enough. The mahogany desk in the lawyer's office gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its polished surface reflecting the exhaustion in my face. As the attorney slid the final document toward me, I noticed how his cufflinks caught the light, tiny silver squares that reminded me of the ones Dad used to wear to important meetings. The memory made my hand hesitate for just a second before I signed my name with a flourish that belied the tremor in my fingers. Your father's lawyers have been calling, the attorney said, adjusting his glasses. He's contesting the... I didn't let him finish. No. The single syllable echoed in the quiet room as I tucked the check into my wallet, right behind the worn photograph of Mom that I carried everywhere. The amount would have shocked me once, back when I still cared about their opinions, back when I still hoped for apologies that would never come. Outside, the city moved on without noticing my small victory. Taxis honked, pedestrians hurried by with their coffees and conversations, and somewhere in the midst of it all, my father was probably sitting in some dimly lit bar, drowning his sorrows in bottom-shelf whiskey. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Another blocked number, another desperate plea I would never hear. I silenced it without looking. The apartment in Boston smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Sunlight streamed through the bare windows as I unpacked the last box, carefully unwrapping Mom's favorite vase, the one Evelyn had banished to the basement. Its familiar weight in my hands felt like coming home. When the doorbell rang, I wasn't expecting anyone. The deliverman handed me a small package with a bored expression, already turning away before I could ask questions. The return address made my breath catch. Greenwood Penitentiary, stamped in stark black letters. Inside, wrapped in yellowing tissue paper, lay Mom's pearl necklace. The one Dad had sold during his first financial crisis. The one I'd searched for in every pawn shop in the city after Mom died. A note fluttered to the floor, the handwriting shaky and unfamiliar in its humility. They found these in storage. You should have them. I'm trying to be better. I know it's too late, but The rest was scratched out, the paper torn where he'd clearly struggled to find the right words. I ran my fingers over the pearls, their smooth surfaces cool against my skin, before placing them carefully in my jewelry box beside Mom's wedding band. The note I crumpled slowly, watching as it disappeared beneath yesterday's coffee grounds in the trash. Some apologies come wrapped in too much pain to accept. Paris smelled of rain and fresh bread, the cobblestone streets glistening under the morning sun. My editor laughed as she read my latest article, her red lipstick leaving marks on her coffee cup. You're merciless, she said, grinning. I love it. My phone buzzed on the wrought iron table, the screen lighting up with an email notification. Lila's name appeared above a subject line that made my stomach clench. Dad. In hospice. Asking for you. Across the street, a young couple paused beneath a chestnut tree, their laughter floating toward me on the breeze. The woman leaned into her partner's touch, her face alight with uncomplicated joy. I watched them for a long moment before turning back to my phone, my finger hovering over the delete button. The past had taught me this much. Some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, its envelope crisp and official looking. The lawyer's note, paperclip to the front, explained that it had been sitting in a safety deposit box for years, waiting for a moment that would never come. I left it on my kitchen counter for days, watching as the steam from my coffee mug made the paper curl at the edges. When I finally opened it, the scent of old paper and faint cologne, something cheap and familiar, rose from the pages. His handwriting was weaker than I remembered, the letters trembling across the page. I don't ask for forgiveness, only that you know the man who failed you wasn't all I was. The best parts of me, the parts that read you bedtime stories, that held your mother like she was the only solid thing in the world, that loved you before I forgot how to love anything. Those parts were real. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you, even when everything I did made it impossible. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it behind Mom's photograph in my wallet. Not because I forgave her, but because every story deserves an ending, even if it comes too late to change it.